The mansion loomed in the distance, shrouded by a canopy of twisting trees. Known as Blackthorn Manor, it had stood abandoned for decades, whispered about in hushed tones. Local lore spoke of a curse that befell anyone who dared to enter, a place where greed was punished and souls were consumed. For Danny, the leader of a small crew of burglars, it was an opportunity too tempting to resist. The rumors of priceless antiques and hidden treasures outweighed the superstitions. He assembled his team: Mitch, the muscle; Carla, the tech expert; and Vince, the getaway driver. They planned the heist meticulously, confident they could be in and out before sunrise. Under the cover of night, they approached the mansion. Its blackened windows glared like soulless eyes, and the air around it was unnervingly still. Carla disabled the security system with ease, and the ornate iron gates creaked open. Inside, the grandeur of the house was undeniable. Chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls, and marble floors gleamed under their flashlights. But something felt off. The air was heavy, and their footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the house were breathing with them. "Split up," Danny ordered. "The faster we gather what we need, the faster we're out." Reluctantly, the group scattered, unaware they were playing right into the house's hands. Mitch entered a library filled with ancient books and gilded artifacts. His eyes fell on a jeweled dagger displayed in a glass case. The moment he picked it up, the room's temperature plummeted. A whisper brushed against his ear. "Greed will bleed you dry." He turned, but no one was there. Dismissing it as his imagination, he pocketed the dagger. As he left the room, a shadow detached itself from the wall and followed silently. Carla worked in the study, hacking into a locked safe. The digital display flickered, but she barely noticed. When the safe opened, she found stacks of cash and an ornate necklace. As she reached for the necklace, her laptop screen suddenly displayed a live feed of herself. In the video, a figure loomed behind her, its elongated arms reaching out. She spun around, but the room was empty. Shaking it off, she shoved the cash and necklace into her bag. Danny discovered a room filled with paintings, each depicting scenes of betrayal and violence. One painting caught his eye: a group of thieves arguing over a pile of gold, their faces contorted with rage. As he stared, the figures in the painting began to move, their mouths silently screaming. He blinked, and the painting was still again. Vince waited outside in the van, the engine idling. But his radio crackled with static, and a distorted voice whispered, "You can't leave them. Not yet." The van doors locked themselves, and the headlights flickered. Vince's breath fogged up the windshield as a shadow passed by outside. When the group reunited in the grand hall, tensions were high. Mitch accused Carla of keeping the best loot for herself, while Danny tried to maintain order. The house seemed to feed on their paranoia, amplifying their suspicions. "Stop being idiots," Carla snapped. "We need to leave." But when they tried to exit, the front door wouldn't budge. The windows were unbreakable, and the house groaned like a living thing. "This isn't right," Danny muttered. As they searched for another way out, the house began to change. Hallways stretched endlessly, rooms rearranged themselves, and whispers echoed from nowhere. Mitch was the first to snap, turning on Carla with the dagger he'd stolen. "You're hiding something!" he shouted, his eyes wild. Before anyone could stop him, he lunged. Carla dodged, and the dagger struck the wall. The shadow that had followed Mitch enveloped him, pulling him into the darkness. His screams were cut short. The remaining three fled, but the house wasn't finished. Carla's bag grew heavier with every step, the necklace seeming to burn through the fabric. She stopped to throw it away, but the bag ripped open, and the items spilled across the floor. The shadows surged toward her. Danny and Vince watched in horror as Carla's body twisted and contorted, her mouth frozen in a silent scream, before she disappeared. Danny and Vince made it to the basement, finding a hidden passage that seemed to lead outside. Desperation drove them forward, but halfway through the tunnel, Vince stopped. "What's wrong?" Danny asked, panicked. Vince's face was pale. "I'm not going. It's my fault we're here. I can't leave." Before Danny could argue, Vince turned and walked back into the mansion. Danny continued alone, emerging into the woods. Gasping for air, he ran to the van, which was unlocked and running. But when he climbed inside, the mirrors showed not his reflection but the house behind him. In the rearview mirror, the front door creaked open, revealing shadowy figures staring out. The engine roared to life, but the van wouldn't move. The shadows spilled from the house, consuming everything in their path. The next morning, Blackthorn Manor was as silent as ever. The van sat empty at the gate, its doors wide open. The town gained a new rumor. Anyone who dared to approach the mansion at midnight could hear whispers of the thieves, still trapped inside, playing the game the house had started. The mall was always eerily quiet after hours. The hum of fluorescent lights and the faint echoes of distant ventilation were Tom's only companions. For 10 years he had worked as the night guard, ensuring the place was secure and free of intruders. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was steady, and the solitude didn't bother him. On this particular night, something felt different. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the air seemed heavier, charged with an invisible tension. As Tom made his usual rounds, his flashlight cutting through the dimly lit corridors, he noticed something strange in the window display of a high-end clothing store. The mannequin in the center of the display seemed wrong. It stood in an exaggerated pose, one arm bent upward as if waving, its head tilted slightly to the side. Tom had seen it countless times before, but tonight it felt as though the lifeless figure was watching him. "Just my imagination," he muttered, shaking his head. He continued walking, his boots echoing against the tiled floor. When Tom looped back to the same corridor on his next circuit, he stopped abruptly. The mannequin had moved. It now stood with its arm lowered, its head facing forward, staring out of the glass directly at him. Tom's pulse quickened. He approached the display, shining his flashlight on the mannequin. There were no signs of tampering, no open doors or disturbed props. "Probably just a prank," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Back in the security office, Tom reviewed the surveillance footage. At first, the mannequin was stationary, frozen in its original pose. Then, without warning, it moved. Its head turned slowly toward the camera, its arm dropping to its side. Moments later, it stepped off the display platform, walking toward the lens with unnatural fluidity. Tom rewound the footage, unable to believe what he was seeing. His stomach twisted as he watched the scene again and again, hoping for an explanation. Then the lights flickered. Tom froze. The crackling of static filled the room, growing louder until it drowned out the faint hum of the monitors. On one of the live feeds, the mannequin was gone from the display window. A cold sweat broke out on Tom's forehead. He scanned the cameras frantically, searching for any sign of movement. Then, on the feed from the east corridor, he saw it. The mannequin was standing in the middle of the hallway, perfectly still. Tom grabbed his flashlight and bolted from the control room. His boots pounded against the floor as he ran toward the east corridor, determined to catch whoever was behind the prank. When he turned the corner, he skidded to a halt. The mannequin stood at the far end of the hallway, its head tilted again, as if studying him. "Who's there?" Tom shouted, his voice echoing through the empty mall. The mannequin took a step forward. Tom's heart raced as he took a step back. "Stay right there," he barked, but his words faltered. The mannequin moved again, each step unnervingly smooth, as though it wasn't bound by the limitations of plastic. Panic surged through Tom. He turned and ran, ducking into a supply closet and slamming the door shut behind him. His hands shook as he fumbled for his phone, but there was no signal. The crackling static returned, louder now, interwoven with faint whispers. They seemed to seep through the walls, surrounding him. The door handle rattled. Tom grabbed a wrench from a shelf and braced himself. "Whoever you are, this isn't funny," he yelled, his voice trembling. The door creaked open, and the mannequin stood there, its blank face now inches from his. Its head tilted further, and for the first time, it spoke. Its voice was a distorted amalgamation of static and human tones, chillingly devoid of emotion. "Visitor." Tom's scream echoed through the mall, swallowed by the oppressive static. The next morning, the day guard found the control room empty and Tom's flashlight abandoned in the east corridor. The mannequin was back in its display, posed as if it had never moved. But its head was tilted slightly, facing the camera. Its blank face seemed to carry an unspoken message. The visitor wasn't gone. It was waiting. The old subway tunnels beneath the city had been abandoned for years. Decades ago, the station was shut down after a series of unexplained accidents and eerie reports of strange sightings. Now, the tunnels were just a memory, a dark and forgotten part of the city's past. But for a group of 5 friends, Jake, Mia, Luke, Sarah, and Emily, the curiosity of the unknown was too tempting to resist. They had heard the rumors, stories of people who had ventured into the tunnels only to come back changed, if they came back at all. But none of them believed the stories. They were just urban legends, right? The group entered the subway through a hidden entrance, an old maintenance hatch near the outskirts of the city. The air was thick with dust, the faint smell of mildew and rust filling their nostrils as they descended. The walls were covered in layers of grime and graffiti, remnants of a time long gone. Their flashlights flickered in the oppressive darkness, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. "We should have brought more gear," Luke muttered, his voice low as they walked deeper into the abandoned tunnels. "Relax, Luke. It's just a couple of old tunnels," Jake replied, his voice echoing off the walls. The further they ventured, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. The sound of their footsteps reverberated, creating an eerie rhythm, but there was something off about it. It sounded like there were other footsteps, footsteps that didn't belong to any of them. "Did you hear that?" Mia whispered, stopping in her tracks. Everyone froze, straining their ears. The faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, was unmistakable. But no one else was around. The tunnel was empty. "It's probably just the echoes," Sarah said, trying to sound confident. But the sounds persisted. They grew louder, closer, and more erratic. Whoever or whatever was following them wasn't trying to hide anymore. It was drawing closer, and it seemed to move with unnatural speed. The group picked up their pace, their flashlights darting from wall to wall, but they saw no one. Only the faint flicker of the lights above, the dim glow of their own torches, and the growing sound of footsteps in pursuit. "Okay, this isn't funny anymore," Emily said, her voice trembling. "Let's get out of here." They turned a corner, only to stop dead in their tracks. Before them stood a dark, unmarked station, one they hadn't seen on any of the maps they'd studied. The platform was empty, but the air was thick with a sense of foreboding. The tunnel beyond it stretched further into the darkness. Without warning, a cold wind swept through the station, extinguishing their flashlights for a split second. When they flicked them back on, the figure was standing there. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, just a shadow in the distance. But as they stared, the figure moved closer, stepping into the weak beam of their flashlights. The figure was tall, gaunt, and dressed in ragged clothing that seemed to have fused with the shadows themselves. Its face was obscured by a mask, an unsettling, featureless white face that reflected no light. The figure's eyes were black pits, hollow and deep, staring into them with a cold, unfeeling gaze. The air grew colder. The group felt a pressure building, like the walls were closing in on them. It's just a person, right?" Luke stammered, his voice cracking with fear. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it moved forward with unnatural speed, its steps echoing off the walls in a rhythmic, relentless manner. "No!" Jake shouted, turning to run. The The group scattered, but no matter how fast they ran, the figure was always just a few steps behind them. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. They couldn't escape. Every corner they rounded only led them deeper into the darkness. In their frantic flight, they reached another platform. This one was darker, colder, the lights flickering like dying stars. The shadowy figure appeared at the far end of the platform, its hollow eyes trained on them. It didn't need to move fast anymore. It was already there. "You can't leave!" a voice rasped from the darkness. It was a low, guttural sound, barely a whisper, but it was enough to freeze them in their tracks. The figure stepped closer, its footsteps now the only sound in the tunnel. "Who are you?" Mia screamed, her voice echoing in the vast emptiness. The figure's head tilted slightly, as if considering the question. Then, with a twisted grin, it stepped forward, closing the gap between them. "I've been here a long time," it whispered, its voice like nails on chalkboard. "And you will be too." The group backed up, their hearts pounding in terror, but there was nowhere to run. No exit, no escape, just the endless dark tunnel, and the figure that had been stalking them, waiting for the moment to claim them as its own. And as the figure reached out with cold, skeletal hands, the last thing they heard were the footsteps, echoing and endless, fading into silence. The tunnels were quiet again, just as they had always been.